We now go on to the panel discussion, which features the theme leads, or various theme leads. Conversation is going to be moderated by Andy Gonzalez, who's from the Department of Biology and a co-lead of the research theme Adapting Urban Environments for the Future. We will just fit it in before 5 o'clock, or maybe just a little bit after. It's 30 minutes, and it's a conversation, and it's also going to, we invite audience participation, but what we would like to ask you is that you keep your comments really small so that everybody gets a chance to ask questions and to discuss. So we're going to cut you off after 10 seconds. No, we're not. But so on that case, at that moment, we'll invite Andy to come up and bring everybody else up.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Gonzalez. I'm a professor in the Department of Biology and a co-lead of the Adapting Urban Environments theme. And I am joined on stage by my colleagues, but we only have 2 themes here. Here comes a third. So we have Audrey for the Creating Sustainable Materials theme, Elena Bennett, who has joined us here on Sustaining Landscapes for the Future, and David Waxmuth here for Adapting Urban Environments. So the goal of this bit of the proceedings is to engage you with our research themes. We felt as a group that we weren't getting enough of an opportunity to exchange, to have an osmotic exchange with you, the audience, with the themes. The themes really are here to stimulate a new way of doing research at McGill, to try to support a transition to how we do research on sustainability. And we, thank you. And we feel that there are a couple of ways to do that. One is I'm going to prod them all with a question to get the ball rolling. And they're going to each take it in turns to answer this question. And then from there, I hope it'll open up the conversation to some questions and answers in this room. So my first question to everybody is, what do you understand by a sustainability transition, and do you have examples within your research theme? Geez, thanks, Andy.
Okay, so I'll jump. So I'm Elena. I'm one of the chairs of the landscape theme, and I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to hand over to Lakshmi when I need to run and catch the last train that will take me home today. So we'll have a transition of the landscape leadership. We had such an interesting conversation about what transition means at our table, and a lot of that focused around sort of top-down versus bottom-up approaches. And I think I maybe won't answer the question, but I will more sort of pose that as an interesting thing that I think that we need to think about, and something that we see in landscapes is this, you know, both bottom up and top down kind of coming together, where we get a mix of the personal, the political, the values all coming together in a way that leads to transitions.
Yeah, so I'm Audrey Morris from chemistry, and here representing the materials team. So the way we approach this concept of transition was at first we were, I think, very scared about it. And I think that the way we decided to approach that is to gather colleagues that would have very different backgrounds and very different look on what sustainability means, and try to focus on a small number of materials for which we could try to see how the sustainability definition of each member would apply and would what kind of ideas that we develop around this. And this actually led us to constitute groups of researchers that are tackling a certain material from the synthesis all the way to the application, and try to understand by various viewpoints what the sustainability impact is of all of these steps of the lifetime of a material, and trying by doing that to first understand really what impact they have, and then try to develop more sustainable solutions based on that. And this really kind of resonates a bit with some of the conversation we had on metrics and one we had on transitions today, because I don't think we're quite ready to transition anything yet, but I think that we start to build an understanding of where the big hotspots are to make that happen.
I'm David Walksmith from Urban Planning and from the Urban Environments theme. And when I think about sustainability transitions, basically from a social science perspective, what I'm always drawn to are the aspects of the kind of broader socio-environmental systems that represent the kind of the blockage points. And I think, when you look at different aspects of human society, and particularly the need to decarbonize human society, it's kind of clear that there's some areas where there just are technological barriers that need to be overcome. It's not 100% obvious how we're going to decarbonize air travel. But then there are plenty where that isn't the case, and in fact there are lots of good ideas and we're just not using them. So the concept of transition for me gets at the fact that there is this kind of multi-dimensionality, which obviously echoes Joachin's discussion in the keynote a minute ago, and that some of the kind of pressure points are going to be technical or technological, but actually many are political and social. And when we look at this question in the context of cities, I think for kind of a concrete example, like literally a concrete example, one of the things we see is that the way that the built environment of different cities looks enable or constrain possible sustainable futures in very profound ways. And so I brought this up at our table discussion, but the easiest way to know if a city is going to have an easy time trying to encourage more sustainable transportation options, for example, was that city built before or after cars became very widespread in that part of the world? And that's simply because the roads that we have built stay with us for 100 years or more. And so that we kind of live in systems which themselves kind of provide opportunities and also blockages to larger sustainability transitions. I think it's kind of really interesting how some of those kind of technical aspects of how society is built interact with some of the political and social ones.
Catherine, please, yeah.
I think it works. So I will answer as a co-lead of the Sustainability Transitions team, so not as a biologist. My answer would be different. Basically, the talk we just had, I think, made a very elegant definition. That's the one we've been working with. And I want to emphasize elements that to me were very important, which is the local and sectoral context. So transitions will be multiple, and they will collate in a systems change. So for me, that's very important. And also the notion of experimentation and then acceleration. So, there will be people trying things, and then what we need is to try and put that together. So in the transition team, we are a very, quite large number of researchers and very multidisciplinary. So we have people in narratives, we have people looking at computer, building platforms. So we're interested in taking advantage of digital to go there. And just two examples of things or observation we have. We're a very new team, so we're just beginning. But at the very beginning, I was invited by a restaurant in a suburb of Montreal that's, just contacted me and say, I want to reduce the emissions of my restaurant. Could you come and meet my staff? Okay, so I thought that's good. We're working on business, so that's, fine. And it was extremely interesting what happened, because we started with the menu, getting rid of some of the beef, pretty obvious. Then where does the other beef that stays in the menu come from? Argentina versus Prince Edward Island, and therefore sourcing. And then we looked into their supply chain, And somehow, in a matter of less than a year, this restaurant owner of Repentigny, Quebec, where the restaurant is surrounded by a parking lot, is now becoming a star in Le Journal of Montréal, you know, always talking about sustainability, and profoundly changed the practice of his business, which is quite interesting. So we're trying to understand. Another, you know, SME that we found was a pharmacy that decided to build their pharmacy as a carbon neutral building, provides an electric charger that's in the small village of the Eastern Township, provide electric charger for cars, but moreover, as a clerk, that when you say, I want to buy a Q-tips, goes with you to the tablet and says, you can buy the regular Q-tip, but we have this bamboo Q-tip that blah, 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 and gives you through all of the sustainability choice. So we want to understand why people make these decisions. Why have they decided to change? And then how can their desire for change can be appropriated by others. And I think Dror, who's sitting there and should be here instead, it has been, you know, saying there's an element of, if you do something that is really good, that you feel great about, there's this very positive motivation for change. So we're I think, are also tempted to eventually go into the psychology of all of that. So moving not in the technological part of the transition, but more on the human, the values, and the fibers.
Thank you for those. So now you know a little bit about the opinions of the different themes. Really what this whole effort is about is breaking down the barriers that exist within the academic context, the academic silos that we have within departments and faculties, essentially the legacies that David was talking about in the way that roads are built in cities. Well, we have a similar kind of legacy that impedes the flow of information and learning across the university. And so how do we break that as a collective, as a set of themes? And how do we help you figure out how to work with you? How can we, as a set of themes, achieve that transition? There are obviously, it's challenging research. There are risks of failure. We have to experiment, we have to try things, and we don't always get funding for the kinds of research that we're talking about. So what I want to do at this point is open the floor to you and see if there are things that you want to try to achieve. Are there questions that you would like us to address? And we'll see if our panel can respond to those questions. So I just threw that out there, of course, and now there's a vacuum of, it's always a bit intimidating to pick up a question like that. Yes, please. From our keynote.
So I was wondering whether you would recommend your students to study sustainability transitions. And the reasons why. Maybe just a pro and a con.
I'll say something about that. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that there are two ways to think about the kind of human environmental future, and the pessimistic and the optimistic way. And probably in either case, but hopefully focusing on the optimistic case, I think in very pragmatic terms, sustainability research is going to have to be a growth industry. And not just a growth industry in the sense of more people doing kind of environmental research with a capital E, but also that the kind of the web or the spread of who considers themselves to be sustainability researchers is going to necessarily spread. And again, to kind of a very kind of specific example of this in my field, we really now in urban planning understand how important housing is to the environmental kind of trajectory of urban life. It's just very clear that dense living arrangements are more energy efficient, and so that in fact housing policy turns out to be environmental policy. Now, I think so. That's kind of like common sense now in our field, but 30 years ago, you just would have been greeted with the biggest, blankest stares if you tried to make that point. I think that that's a process that's going to accelerate, and that, that it's going to be harder and harder to find areas of academic research that don't have some connections with sustainability, given just the magnitude of the challenge we all face. So in that sense, like, it's one thing to say, I would encourage, graduate students to be working on kind of questions of sustainability directly, but also just to kind of, that we're all going to need to be involved in this kind of process of self-interrogation about how our research, whatever it is, fundamentally, kind of ultimately connects to some of these issues around sustainability transitions.
First Elena, and then Catherine.
So I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to turn over my seat to Lakshmi. And I would say for me, and for landscapes in general, the answer is also yes, but for slightly different reasons. I think we, in landscape ecology or ecosystem ecology, have gotten to a place where we have a lot of the ecological answers and understanding, and we have, on the other side, a lot of clear goals, things like the Sustainable Development Goals that lay out where we want our landscapes to go and what we want them to look like. And we have almost no sense of what the path is that helps us use those ecological answers and that ecological understanding together with those goals to understand the implications of taking different pathways toward those goals in terms of who are the winners and who are the losers, and what are the implications when we know that pathways leave legacies and that those things are really important. So to me, it's probably the most important, or at least one of the most important areas in landscapes, is really thinking about transitions and transformations and how do we get there.
So maybe following along those lines, I think just looking at who is sitting in this, we have an architect, a chemist, an ag person, and a biologist. We don't have a political scientist. So we have a real challenge, just like Helena was saying, and David. This is the knowledge we need, and somehow we seem to not have enough of the political scientists to support the needs of the more, natural science kind of disciplines in that. And so it is a real challenge then when you want to train students. For us in the Sustainability Transition team, we now have, for example, our first master's student, and we're like, okay, what? Like, is he going to get a master's degree in biology to work on small business narrative, or an MBA? So there's a big problem both of shortage of political scientists or transition scholars to help us, and there's a mismatch between the discipline and degrees we give. And so that hinders our ability to take students, I think.
Lakshmi, do you want to come join the panel? I think you need some landscape representation. So let me try again with the question.
Audrey wants to speak.
Oh, sorry, Audrey, my bad. Doing a bad job.
Actually, yeah, I think it was a bit of a rhetorical question, so it's hard to answer no to your question, right? It's good. But I'm going to try to answer a little bit no to your question. So I think it's incredibly important to expose students to modern concepts and to have them being citizens and being exposed to all sorts of ideas. And in particular, this transition is absolutely key to so many political issues now that I'm really glad to see, like almost 2/3 of my group being present here. This is really important for them. But on the other hand, I really strongly believe as an educator that if you really want to make a change, you need to be an extremely solid expert in your field. So I really believe in this T-shaped education system where you know really well your discipline, but then you're also able to communicate and exchange with people from other disciplines around. So in doing that, you have to be careful that you don't overload them with all of this extra knowledge, and you really make sure that they keep remaining good experts. So I think that would be my nuance in the answer. Of course, it's super important they're exposed to those ideas, but my students have to be chemists. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to provide some of the materials that hopefully will help the transitions that we're talking about.
Other questions? Yes, in the middle.
Thank you. So I'm Nyla. I'm a PhD student in neuroscience, and this might be a bit left field as a question, but I was wondering, speaking specifically about the system of academic research. So instead of, doing research on sustainability, how we can do research more sustainably, and along with some other students in our building at the Neuro, we started a little Green Labs initiative. So we're trying to address some of these issues of the plastic waste, the water and energy waste, as well as all of the products we get shipped in huge styrofoam boxes. And I realize those are very small things to address. It's where we're starting as students, but I was wondering if you have some kind of ideas on an institutional level, on a policy level of how we could start doing research more sustainably. And I think it's also, I understand that it's behavioral in that we, as researchers, we think we're doing good anyway in contributing to the world through our research, and then we don't think about the impact, the environmental impact. Okay, now that I've rambled.
So today I had the privilege of having lunch with Dror and with the speaker, and he was mentioning the inner transition. So I don't think it is meaningless. I think that the transition will only happen if every one of us also transition in our brain. And I don't have the final answer, but I managed to get all the way up to the principal and the provost along with me in a meeting, telling them McGill has to do something about the flights of the researchers and the student, because we take planes without thinking about that. I think that's extremely damaging. I think McGill needs a policy. I proposed a solution to that entailed a very aggressive campaign to reduce the flights as much as possible. And for those scholars that are able to sort of show a reduction in their flights and alternatives that they've taken, help to offset the remaining of their emissions. And it would involve, of course, planting tree. I'm a biologist in the tropics where they grow faster in a time frame that is coherent with the IPCC 1.5 degree report. And they told me I would have an answer before Christmas. So I'm hoping at least McGill will do this.
Are there thoughts from others in the room about that question even? Tai.
I think it's come up in a couple different contexts of just this idea of individual versus collective action, and sort of how much burden do we put on the individual, and how much guilt do we need to feel as the individual, and how much as an individual do I need to personally be committing to this. So I don't have an answer to this, but it seems like in terms of things that we need to tackle in this room, it's something about what do we want to be focusing on? Do we want to be pushing for solutions for individuals, or do we want to be pushing for solutions that some governments could enact, or is it some combination of the two? And I think the easy answer is it's some combination of the two, but that just is like washing away the specifics. And so I think we need to have a hard conversation about how much we can do as individuals versus how much some collective action needs to happen.
One way to think about that is that I think it can be kind of like a distinction, the individuals or collectives, but it can also be true that people live their values, and I think something that I like that people, if you're focused on the kind of big structural collective dimensions of sustainability problems, it's still just inherently going to be the case that you're exposed, in your brain. I mean, I thought that you said the transition in your brain, that's a good way to put it, that, it becomes harder to see certain things in the world the way you used to because you've got these new kind of preoccupations related to sustainability. So I think that, the example of kind of trying to make kind of a greener lab, it's going to take a lot of green labs to, reduce, global warming to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. But on some level, it's part of a kind of broader, internal transition that I think is really powerful and important. So in that sense, I don't know how to do it. I don't have a lab with actual equipment. My lab is like a lab. But I think that you know, I think it's really encouraging to think about what some of those kind of smaller collective actions would look like, simply because I bet they are in a kind of virtuous circle with the kind of psychological changes that we all need.
Audrey.
Yeah, so there was several initiatives in chemistry over the years that have been here. Students changing some of the modules of their teaching lab to reduce the solvent use or the waste generated. Professors doing that kind of stuff as well. We had some different sustainability project funded programs around limiting the energy use by having campaigns around sash closing and stuff like this. So there's been lots of efforts, and I really want to acknowledge what the neuro student did here, because I read about it and I want to give you a big kudos to you for doing that. I think what we're missing potentially here is people to organize themselves around those things, because from my experience, these have been really great efforts, and then those people would leave, and all of it is sometimes continued, but sometimes not so much, and sometimes even forgotten about. So I think that if there was leadership at the student level to really try to organize these things a little bit more, it would be, I think, very beneficial to actually sharing best practices amongst yourself. I think we're all struggling with plastic use in the lab, for instance, so you could teach a lot of things to chemistry students in particular, and stuff like that. So I think that would be my comment to you. Maybe you guys can try to see how you could organize, and certainly congratulations to you on this.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
One of the things I was thinking about is why it's not included in for instance, in biosafety and chem safety training, I don't know who I would talk to in regards to getting that included, but I think just training new students to think about it would be a start.
So there's a waste management training, but I don't think everybody needs to take it. So you're right that safety might be a better place to start, but you could try to reach out to people handling waste who can be great allies for you in that regard.
Catherine is going to have a go at Ty's question.
I'm just, in French I would say, je suis interpellée. I am questioned by your use of guilt, and it could be pride. And I think it's very important. Are you making an action, changing your ways, and then you're proud? Or are you not? I don't think guilt is a good motivator. I would certainly never argue or never try to guilt anybody, but I can see people that are proud of making changes, and I agree that you know, there's individual and collective, and I think everything, it is so urgent, we just need everything. And I think we feel very good when we do things, and I think there's a lot of discussion to have on the issues of self-care. Self-care has gone very slippery into very egoistic, personal sort of things, and maybe the real self-care is a bit more collective. So I think your choice of word is something that suggests, again, maybe we need a psychologist to work with us on those issues that I find are very important.
So one point I would like to add to the mix here that I think we can do collectively as part of MSSI. Some years ago, I did some calculations on the cost of lost data and lost information. So did you know that the half-life of the information that you all generate, the data we have on our computers and in your spreadsheets and in your notebooks, is 14 years? So there is a constant waste of the knowledge that we're generating and sharing. And annually, that costs the equivalent of the economy of Spain. So if you think about the carbon that we're burning to do the science that is laudable and important, but then we don't consider what we're doing to protect the legacy of that information and the cultural value of that information at a time when we're trying to experiment, to take risks, to get to a transition, I think we can be much more proactive about how we curate our knowledge and how we can store that knowledge. And that's maybe something that we can think about as a group of themes, but also what we can think about as a community going ahead is how we choose to create knowledge together, but also make sure that it persists in the long term for future generations that we're trying to do this for. So I see Heather is hovering. And so I need to wrap up this panel. So maybe just join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts today.
And also, thank you to all of you, and thank you to Andy for moderating. So we're going to wrap up now, and Anja Geitman, who is the Dean of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, and another member of the MSSI Executive Committee, is going to give us some closing thoughts. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to see all of you here. This is really a fruit of a couple of years' labor. And before I forget, I would like to acknowledge the people who actually make all this happen, and that is not the executive committee. It is Heather and her team, and so I invite you to join me in thanking them for putting not only together this event, but the entire MSSI. As Heather can probably attest, herding deans is worse than herding cats, is herding peacocks, and so that's more than just a fish, more than justified. Having said that, it was incredibly interesting today to follow what has been going on, and so a couple of things that I retained were, for example, what our keynote speaker said earlier, the difference between low-hanging fruit and the big fruit that is hanging in that tree, which is not necessarily the same thing. And so these are things that we have to continue pondering, right? And one of the big pieces of fruit, apples or pears, whatever they are, is of course the simple number of people on this planet, right? Is there any technology that is going to be able to address that? No, it's probably more education than anything else and changing our habits. And so while we as scientists, and most of you in the room are probably from the STEM fields, try to do in our daily lives, finding solutions that are based on technology might really only be a part of that puzzle, and changing our habits, such as reducing our flight numbers, etc., will be a huge part of this puzzle that we have to work on, in each of us has to do. And as a university, we have to educate people in terms of the importance of this aspect. Earlier it has been noted that we don't have any or only few political scientists in the room. Another unit at university that has been relatively recently created is, of course, the new School of Public Policy. And the thinking is that if and when, hopefully, the Sustainability Initiative might move up to the new Vic, the Royal Vic Hospital, the new School of Public Policy will be part of it, and thus by physical proximity of these units, we actually create this osmosis that will enable us to talk to each other and mutually reinforce the message that we need to work together in contributing to this field. Having said all this, the only thing between you and a glass of wine is me, and so this is an unsustainable situation. I recognize that. With that, I thank you all for being here and for contributing this, and I hope that this has been inspiring to you, and I hope you take this into the next months and years of your work. And I certainly hope that today you met at least one person you never talked to before, and you have, and if you have not, you will now over a glass of wine. So with that, thank you for being here, and I wish you a very good rest of the evening.